Did Prince William really betray Princess Catherine while the world was watching? Or was this just another royal rumor spun out of control? Imagine, for a moment, the image we've all built of Prince William. Composed, dutiful, the heir apparent, someone who carries the weight of the monarchy with a steady hand. Now imagine that same figure, behind closed doors, making choices that could shatter not only his own life, but the life of the woman he vowed to love. It's a story that seems ripped straight from a tabloid headline, yet insiders suggest there is far more beneath the surface. Secrets, late-night meetings, whispered phone calls, and a scandal that could shake the monarchy to its core. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. The question is, why is this story emerging now? Why would a prince, groomed from birth to uphold a carefully curated public image, risk everything for an affair? And perhaps more importantly, how did this alleged betrayal impact Princess Catherine, who, by all appearances, seemed the perfect consort, poised, graceful, unshakable in public, yet devastated in private? The public rarely sees the private lives of royals. For every smile on a balcony, for every gracious wave during a public appearance, there is an untold story of pressure, expectation, and sometimes heartbreak. When the rumors first started circulating, whispers suggested that William's connection with Rose Hanburg was fleeting, a mere spark in the royal furnace. But sources close to the palace have claimed that what began as a casual flirtation escalated into something much deeper, more intimate, and far more consequential than anyone anticipated. You might be wondering, who is Rose Hanburg, and how did she become entangled in one of the most tightly controlled royal households in the world? She is, according to multiple sources, intelligent, charismatic, and striking, someone who could command attention in any room she entered. But her charm alone isn't what allegedly drew William toward her. There was an undeniable chemistry, a magnetic pull that seemed impossible to resist, and the timing couldn't have been worse. At a moment when Princess Catherine was focusing on her own charitable initiatives and the couple's public image, the spark that started with a chance meeting allegedly grew into a flame that would not be easily contained. Consider this. In the life of a royal, every interaction is scrutinized. Cameras follow every public appearance. Journalists pore over the smallest details, and aides monitor almost everything behind the scenes. And yet, insiders say that William and Rose found ways to connect in secret. Meetings that were meticulously planned, messages that disappeared almost as soon as they were sent, and encounters that left them both exhilarated and terrified. How do you keep a secret like that in a world where every move is potentially headline news? Meanwhile, Princess Catherine, it seems, was left in the dark until certain events forced the truth into the light. What was her reaction when she discovered the betrayal? Reports suggest that she was crushed, inconsolable, her tears a private testament to the pain that no public appearance could hide. One can only imagine the emotional turmoil, the sense of trust broken, the fear of public humiliation, the quiet agony of watching a life you built together seemingly unravel in secret. And yet, the story is not as simple as betrayal and heartbreak. Royals are, by necessity, masters of public perception. Their lives are a delicate dance of duty, appearance, and carefully managed image. If William's alleged affair became public knowledge, the consequences could ripple across the monarchy, affecting not just personal relationships, but also public trust and institutional stability. It's not just a scandal, it's a potential crisis. How do you reconcile personal desires with public obligations? How do you navigate a private life that is under constant public scrutiny? Sources close to the palace claim that this story is far from a mere rumor. Multiple accounts suggest that conversations between William and his advisors, between Catherine and her inner circle, and even between Rose and her confidants, paint a picture of tension, secrecy, and high stakes. William, they say, faced the impossible choice of revealing the truth or burying it, each option carrying profound consequences. Meanwhile, Catherine was forced to confront not only the alleged betrayal, but the very public narrative that would inevitably follow. How do you process that kind of shock when the eyes of the world are already on you? Let's take a moment to consider the timing of these revelations. Why are we hearing this story now? Was it a leak? A carefully orchestrated disclosure? Or a coincidence that the world's attention was elsewhere, making this the perfect moment for secrets to surface? Insiders hint at a combination of personal motives, media strategy, and the inexorable pull of truth. In a life where privacy is nearly impossible, secrets have a way of escaping, often at the most inopportune times. And when they do, the impact can be catastrophic. But before we delve into the alleged affair itself, let's explore the context that makes this story so compelling. Royals live in a world unlike any other, one of privilege, expectation, and scrutiny. Their choices are magnified, their mistakes immortalized. For Prince William, every action is measured not just by personal consequence, but by public perception. And for Princess Catherine, every tear shed, every moment of pain, is witnessed not only by those closest to her, but by millions around the globe. The stakes couldn't be higher. The alleged affair also raises deeper questions about human nature, desire, and loyalty. Can anyone resist temptation when it presents itself in the most unlikely places? Is the pull of attraction stronger than the bonds of marriage, even in the most scrutinized lives? And what happens when a single decision has the power to alter the course of personal lives, public perception, and even the legacy of a monarchy? We must also consider the media's role in shaping this narrative. Every rumor, every whisper, every photograph carries weight. And the way stories are reported can distort reality, blur truth, and amplify tension. Insiders warn that while some reports are accurate, others are exaggerated, designed to provoke outrage or capture attention. So, as we explore the details of what allegedly happened between William and Rose, it's important to remember that the truth is often complicated, layered, and sometimes deeply uncomfortable. And yet, despite all the secrecy and speculation, one fact remains. The human emotions at the heart of this story are undeniable. Fear, desire, guilt, betrayal, heartbreak. These are experiences that transcend rank, title, or public status. They are universal, and they make the story resonate far beyond the gilded walls of palaces. Viewers are drawn to these narratives not just for the scandal, but for the emotional truth that lies beneath, the tension between duty and desire, the struggle to reconcile private longing with public responsibility. So, as we prepare to explore the details of the alleged affair, the secret meetings, the emotional fallout, and the dramatic confrontations, I ask you to keep one question in mind. How far would you go to follow your heart if the world were watching? How much could you risk before the consequences became unbearable? And perhaps most importantly, what happens when the very institution you are destined to lead becomes intertwined with your most personal failings? But the story doesn't start with betrayal. It starts with a meeting, a seemingly ordinary encounter that would set the stage for a series of events no one could have predicted. It begins with a glance, a conversation, a connection that ignited something far more dangerous than either participant could anticipate. What happened that night, and what followed in its wake, would change the lives of three people forever: William, Catherine, and Rose, and send shockwaves through the very fabric of the monarchy itself. And as we explore this scandal in full, piece by piece, we will uncover moments of tension, secrecy, and desire that were never meant to be seen. We will hear accounts from those closest to the situation, piecing together a story that is both compelling and deeply human. We will ask difficult questions, confront uncomfortable truths, and examine the consequences of choices made in the shadow of public expectation. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. It all started at a charity gala, the kind of event designed to look effortless, polished, and perfectly orchestrated for the cameras. Glittering chandeliers reflected off crystal glasses, soft music floated through the grand hall, and the air was thick with polite conversation and subtle power plays. On the surface, it was just another evening in the life of royalty, elegant, controlled, predictable. But that night, behind the carefully composed smiles and handshakes, something unexpected happened. Something that, according to insiders, would set in motion a series of events destined to shake the royal family in ways no one could have anticipated. Prince William, as always, moved through the room with a practiced grace. His posture straight, his smile measured, his eyes scanning for dignitaries, donors, and supporters. To the public, he appeared the consummate prince. composed, courteous, and entirely in control. But those who know him well suggest that there are moments when even the most disciplined individuals falter, moments when human desire and instinct rise above protocol. And that night, William was about to encounter one of those moments. Enter Rose Hanburg. She wasn't a royal, not by blood or title, but she possessed something far more compelling, a presence. Charismatic, confident, and strikingly intelligent, she had the kind of energy that drew attention without effort. In a room full of glittering gowns and meticulously tailored suits, Rose managed to stand out, not because she tried, but because she had an aura that demanded notice. And it seems that, as William made his rounds, that aura caught his eye in a way that startled even him. What is it about certain people that makes them unforgettable the moment they enter a room? Some say it's confidence, some say it's charm, others say it's simply a spark, an energy that you can't name but instantly recognize. For William, meeting Rose was like encountering that spark in its purest form. And while many would write off such moments as fleeting, those closest to the story insist this was different. There was a tension, a subtle pull that neither could ignore, even as the gala continued around them with its usual pomp and ceremony. The first interaction was, by all accounts, entirely innocent, a polite exchange over shared interests, perhaps a joke about the gala itself, or a brief conversation about charitable work. Yet insiders describe it as electric, the kind of brief encounter that leaves a lasting impression long after the guests have departed. It's fascinating to think about how small, seemingly insignificant moments can change the course of history, isn't it? A glance, a smile, a few words. And suddenly, the trajectory of lives can shift. For William and Rose, that moment marked the beginning of something that would grow far beyond the walls of the ballroom. And what about Catherine? At the time, she was immersed in her own responsibilities, engaging with patrons, overseeing initiatives, maintaining the public appearance expected of a princess. She, too, moved with poise, but according to insiders, she was unaware of the storm quietly brewing on the periphery. How could she have known that a chance meeting, one seemingly harmless, would set off a chain of events that would test her patience, her trust, and her very understanding of the man she had married? After the gala, whispers suggest that William found reasons to cross paths with Rose again. A casual charity luncheon, an arts exhibit, a brief introduction by mutual acquaintances. Each encounter was carefully orchestrated, yet under the guise of coincidence. In a world where every step is scrutinized, such encounters are dangerous. Royals cannot afford mistakes, and yet human nature is notoriously difficult to restrain. What drives someone to risk everything in pursuit of fleeting moments of connection? What compels a man groomed for duty to chase desire despite the consequences? Rose, for her part, was reportedly cautious. She knew the risks, understood the stakes, and yet, there was an undeniable curiosity on her side as well. How often does someone of immense stature, influence, and charisma take a genuine interest in you? How often does a person whose entire life is scripted, choreographed, and watched take a pause, if only for a conversation, and seem, for a moment, real, authentic, human? It's a question worth considering. And it's the kind of question that, according to sources, began to dominate both William's and Rose's thoughts in the weeks that followed. And then came the first private moment. Not in the public eye, not in the glare of flashing cameras, but somewhere quiet, discreet, and away from the watchful gaze of aides and palace staff. It's said to have been a late evening walk through the gardens of a mutual acquaintance's estate, the kind of stroll that is entirely innocent on the surface, but laden with potential when two people feel a connection they cannot yet name. Imagine it. Moonlight glinting off manicured lawns, the faint sound of a fountain in the background, a conversation that meanders from pleasantries to confessions. How quickly do boundaries blur when attraction mingles with secrecy? How quickly does excitement turn into tension? It's easy to judge from the outside, but those who have been in similar situations know the paradox. The very risk of getting caught, the thrill of the forbidden, magnifies desire in ways almost impossible to resist. For William, the stakes were extraordinary. Every action, every choice, was measured against a lifetime of expectation. And yet, the pull toward Rose was something he could not ignore, no matter how disciplined he tried to be. Meanwhile, Catherine remained oblivious. At least, that's what the narrative suggests. She continued to focus on her initiatives, her charitable work, her role in the public eye. The world saw a poised, elegant princess, composed under pressure. But private pain often goes unseen. How do you process being betrayed by someone whose life is lived under constant scrutiny? How do you protect your dignity while your heart is quietly breaking? These are questions that Catherine would, reportedly, confront only later. After the whispers, after the subtle signs, after the moments that could no longer be ignored. It's worth noting the psychology at play here. Studies in human behavior consistently show that attraction is heightened by secrecy. Forbidden connections, fleeting encounters, the sense that what you are doing is dangerous. All of this intensifies emotion, making ordinary interactions feel extraordinary. And in the context of royalty, where every action is monitored and every word potentially public, the temptation to steal even a single moment of private connection becomes magnified. Was William aware of this dynamic? Almost certainly. Was he capable of resisting it? According to sources, he struggled profoundly. As the weeks went on, William and Rose's interactions reportedly became more frequent. Insiders described subtle signals, coded messages, and careful planning designed to minimize exposure while maximizing connection. It's fascinating to consider the logistics of such a clandestine relationship. How do you communicate when every phone call could be monitored? How do you meet when cameras could be lurking around every corner? And yet, human ingenuity often finds a way, even in the most restrictive circumstances. The meetings, initially innocuous, began to take on a different character. Shared dinners, quiet conversations, moments that lingered just a little too long. There are accounts suggesting that the emotional intensity grew with each encounter, fueled by anticipation, excitement, and, according to some, a sense of inevitability. What begins as curiosity can, under certain conditions, evolve into something far more intimate, something that challenges the very foundations of trust and loyalty. And yet, even amidst this growing connection, there was awareness of the consequences. Both parties, it seems, understood the potential fallout. But here's the paradox. The higher the stakes, the more compelling the connection can feel. The allure of secrecy, the forbidden thrill, the very danger of discovery. All of it served to heighten emotions, making restraint ever more difficult. How often do we, as humans, knowingly court disaster simply because the risk amplifies desire? It's a question that resonates far beyond the gilded walls of palaces. By the time the gala had faded into memory, by the time the initial meetings had become a pattern, one thing was clear. This was no longer just a chance encounter. Something had shifted, subtly but irrevocably. According to insiders, what began as flirtation had evolved into emotional intimacy. And while there was still caution, still awareness of the potential consequences, there was also a growing compulsion, a pull neither could resist. And so, the stage was set. The private walks, the discreet conversations, the shared glances, all of it created a tension that could not last forever. For William, the challenge was monumental. How to balance duty with desire, public image with private longing. For Rose, it was a delicate dance. How to navigate a connection with someone whose life was both extraordinary and impossibly constrained. And for Catherine, the shadow of what was to come remained unseen, waiting to emerge in ways that would test the very bonds of trust and loyalty. But what happened next would take everything to a new level, a moment that insiders describe as the turning point, the instant when the line between curiosity and consequence blurred irrevocably. And no one, not William, not Rose, not Catherine, could have anticipated the impact of that first crossing of a threshold that was never meant to be crossed. It is said that behind every crown lies a labyrinth of secrets, and for Prince William, this labyrinth had just become far more complex. We often see royals in their polished, public persona, smiling for cameras, engaging with dignitaries, delivering speeches, but the reality is far more complicated. Behind the carefully curated images is a world of expectations, rules, and, occasionally, desires that defy those rules. And it's within this hidden world that William found himself walking a precarious line, one that would test his character, his marriage, and the very foundation of trust in his life. The truth about William's alleged attraction to Rose Hanburg isn't simple. It didn't begin with reckless abandon or a dramatic, instant betrayal. According to insiders, it started subtly, almost imperceptibly, like a shadow stretching across a room that seemed bright and orderly. A lingering glance, a brief touch, a conversation that extended just a moment too long. All of these seemingly minor incidents created a tension that grew heavier with each passing day. And the more this tension built, the harder it became for William to ignore it. You might be asking yourself, how does someone trained for decades in discipline and restraint, someone who carries the weight of a monarchy on his shoulders, suddenly find himself drawn to temptation? The answer, it seems, lies in the collision between human emotion and institutional pressure. Royals, by their very nature, are constrained. Their every action is scrutinized, their every relationship analyzed, and their every misstep magnified for the world to see. And yet, desire is a force that doesn't respect protocol, crown, or title. For William, the pull toward Rose was unlike anything he had encountered before. Sources describe it as magnetic, a feeling that went beyond simple attraction. There was a thrill in their interactions, a sense of being seen in a way that was rare in a life dominated by public expectation. And therein lies the paradox. The very life that demanded control, composure, and propriety created the conditions for an irresistible temptation. When every day is scripted, the allure of an unscripted moment can be overwhelming. Meanwhile, the secrecy of these encounters added to their intensity. There is a psychological truth that many of us can relate to. When something is forbidden, when it must be hidden from the world, it often becomes more enticing. Every stolen glance, every whispered conversation, every private meeting carried a weight, a danger, and, for William and Rose, an undeniable excitement. The stakes were high, and yet that very risk made the connection feel electric. And what about Catherine? At this point, she was still unaware of the growing emotional intimacy between her husband and another woman. She remained focused on her charitable work, her royal duties, and the public perception of her marriage. Yet even the most vigilant can be blindsided by secrets, and insiders suggest that small signs of tension were already present. Subtle changes in William's behavior, moments of distraction, a weight in his demeanor that didn't match the facade of normalcy. How often do we fail to notice what's right in front of us until the consequences can no longer be ignored? It is also worth noting the duality of William's position. On one hand, he had his responsibilities, his family, his public image. On the other, he had a desire that demanded attention, that refused to be silenced. This conflict between duty and desire is not unique to royalty, but the stakes for someone in William's position are extraordinary. A single lapse, a single revelation, could have consequences far beyond personal embarrassment. It could affect the monarchy, the public's trust, and the legacy of a family whose every action is scrutinized. Sources close to the palace suggest that the emotional stakes were compounded by the nature of William's connection with Rose. It wasn't just physical, it was, reportedly, deeply emotional. Conversations that lasted late into the night, moments of vulnerability shared in confidence, and a sense of understanding that William struggled to find elsewhere. All of this created an intimacy that went beyond the fleeting sparks of a casual affair. It was, insiders claim, a connection that was both exhilarating and dangerous, and one that carried profound consequences for everyone involved. Yet even amidst this growing closeness, caution remained a constant companion. Both William and Rose reportedly understood the risks. They were well aware of the consequences of exposure. But here's the paradox. The more dangerous a secret, the more it consumes your thoughts. The risk itself became part of the allure, amplifying emotions and creating a tension that neither could fully escape. How often do we, in our own lives, find ourselves drawn to what we know we shouldn't pursue simply because the consequences make it feel more alive? This tension was mirrored in the private world of the palace. Advisors, aides, and confidants observed shifts in William's demeanor. There were reports of late-night phone calls, moments of distraction during official duties, and an almost imperceptible change in his interactions with Catherine. Nothing concrete, nothing publicly visible, yet enough to suggest that something beneath the surface had begun to ripple outward. How often does the first small tremor of a secret herald the potential for an earthquake? And while William navigated this precarious path, Catherine remained devoted to her own responsibilities. She organized events, engaged with supporters, and maintained the image of a stable, loving marriage. But private intuition, insiders suggest, can sense subtle shifts. Though she may not have known the full extent of William's connection with Rose, small signs, late arrivals, distracted behavior, fleeting expressions of tension, likely planted the seeds of suspicion. Trust, once challenged, is fragile, and even minor cracks can grow when left unaddressed. What makes this story so compelling, however, is not just the betrayal, but the emotional depth behind it. William's alleged conflict wasn't merely about desire. It was about identity, expectation, and the human need for connection. Imagine living a life where every action is measured, every thought monitored, and yet, within that strict structure, you find someone who makes you feel understood, desired, and alive. It's a tension that many can relate to in some form, and it makes the story resonate far beyond the gilded halls of royal residences. As the weeks passed, William and Rose reportedly developed a rhythm to their interactions. Meetings were brief but meaningful. Conversations carried emotional weight, and moments of intimacy, though still restrained by circumstance, began to deepen. Sources suggest that William struggled with guilt, caught between the excitement of connection and the moral weight of what he was doing. Human behavior, after all, is rarely simple. Even those trained to navigate scrutiny and expectation can succumb to the pull of desire when it surfaces unexpectedly. The complexity of these emotions was mirrored in Rose's own experience. Insiders describe her as cautious, aware of the dangers, and yet equally captivated by the bond forming between them. Her perspective adds a layer of nuance. She was not merely a passive participant, but an individual navigating the same tension, balancing risk against emotion, and experiencing the thrill and fear of being involved with someone whose life was anything but ordinary. And what of the palace itself? Advisors reportedly began noticing subtle anomalies, although none could yet confirm the nature of the issue. There were whispered conversations, concerns about appearances, and a heightened sense of vigilance surrounding William's schedule. Every palace, every residence, every engagement became a potential point of exposure. In this world, nothing is private, and yet, paradoxically, true privacy is both irresistible and nearly impossible to maintain. As the emotional intensity grew, so too did the stakes. William's choices were no longer confined to fleeting moments of temptation. They carried the weight of potential public exposure, personal betrayal, and lasting consequences. The relationship with Rose, still largely secret, had evolved into something that insiders describe as emotionally charged and undeniably consequential. It was no longer a casual distraction. It had become a force with the power to change lives. And yet, amidst all this tension, the story was far from reaching its climax. The palace, the public, and even Catherine herself remained largely unaware of the depth of the emotional entanglement unfolding in the shadows. But secrets, no matter how carefully guarded, have a way of surfacing. The greater the secrecy, the more explosive the revelation when it eventually emerges. So, as we move forward into the unfolding scandal, it's crucial to understand that this story is not just about betrayal or desire. It is about the collision of human emotion with institutional expectation, the tension between personal fulfillment and duty, and the profound consequences that can arise when those worlds intersect. William's journey through hidden passions was only beginning, and the emotional stakes were about to escalate in ways no one could have anticipated. And what came next would push boundaries, test loyalties, and leave everyone involved questioning the very nature of love, trust, and duty. What happened after the first private encounters, after the initial sparks, would set the stage for confrontations, heartbreak, and revelations that would change lives forever. This was the night that changed everything. The night when what had been subtle, restrained, and clandestine suddenly became tangible, real, and impossible to ignore. The first intimate encounter between Prince William and Rose Hanburg was not an accident. but insiders describe it as the culmination of weeks of tension, subtle signals, and carefully orchestrated meetings. And while the outside world remained oblivious, inside the walls of secrecy, everything shifted. It began with an invitation that, on the surface, appeared harmless. A private dinner at a mutual friend's estate, intended to celebrate a charity milestone. Polished, public-friendly, perfectly appropriate. But for William and Rose, the evening held possibilities far beyond the polite conversation and refined cuisine. There was an undercurrent, a tension simmering beneath every word, every glance. Imagine sitting across from someone, both of you aware of a connection that has been growing quietly, dangerously, and feeling the impossible pull of attraction in a space designed to contain it. What makes a moment like this so potent? It's the combination of risk, intimacy, and timing. William, despite years of training in discipline and self-restraint, was now navigating a situation that demanded more than casual control. Rose, aware of the stakes but drawn to the connection, mirrored his struggle. There was a magnetic energy between them, one that neither could deny without acknowledging the intensity of what was happening. As the evening progressed, small gestures began to speak volumes. A brush of a hand, a lingering look, subtle shifts in posture, all silent indicators of the tension building between them. The staff and other guests were oblivious, focused on polite conversation and formalities, but William and Rose were attuned to a private rhythm, one that pulsed with anticipation and unsaid words. How often do these small, almost imperceptible moments ignite something far larger? How often do a glance or a gesture carry more weight than words ever could? Insiders suggest that the emotional stakes were already high before the night began. Weeks of covert meetings and exchanged messages had created a foundation of intimacy that made even casual interactions charged. There was excitement, yes, but also guilt, fear, and the knowledge that a single misstep could have catastrophic consequences. And yet, the very tension of being caught only heightened the intensity. It's a paradox that is difficult to resist. The greater the risk, the more electrifying the experience becomes. Dinner ended, as all dinners must, with polite farewells and carefully measured smiles. But the night was far from over. According to insiders, William and Rose took a quiet walk through the estate gardens, away from staff and guests, where the boundaries of propriety began to blur. Moonlight reflected on the manicured lawns, shadows stretching long and creating spaces where words and actions could flow freely. It's in moments like this that secrets, temptation, and desire converge, the perfect storm for a first encounter that neither party would forget. There is a curious tension in these moments. The mind knows the rules, understands the potential fallout, yet the heart and body respond with immediacy. Every brush of the hand, every whispered word, carried the weight of weeks of anticipation and unspoken emotion. For William, it was a collision of duty and desire. For Rose, it was an experience fraught with risk but impossible to resist. How often do we find ourselves at the precipice of what we know we shouldn't do, yet cannot turn away? How often does desire override caution, even when the consequences are monumental? The encounter, according to sources, was both electric and tentative. There was passion, yes, but also caution, a mutual understanding that this was both thrilling and dangerous. Each touch, each moment of closeness, carried an intensity that could not be replicated in the public eye. And while the experience was undeniably intimate, it was also emotionally complex. Guilt intertwined with excitement, fear mixed with longing, and the knowledge of what was happening heightened every sensation. Meanwhile, Catherine remained unaware. At that moment, she was likely engaged in her own charitable commitments, focused on duties that demanded her attention and composure. Yet insiders suggest that subtle cracks in William's behavior were beginning to emerge, moments of distraction, fleeting expressions of guilt or tension, hints that something significant had shifted. It is chilling to consider how quickly a single encounter, hidden from view, can ripple outward, affecting relationships, trust, and perception in ways that cannot be controlled. One of the most fascinating aspects of this encounter is the psychological interplay at work. Research in human behavior consistently shows that secrecy amplifies emotional intensity. The very act of hiding an experience, of knowing it must remain undiscovered, increases the stakes and the emotional payoff. For William and Rose, this dynamic was intensified by the constant awareness that discovery could be catastrophic. The thrill, the danger, and the intensity all combined to create a moment that insiders describe as transformative, both in its immediacy and in its long-term consequences. By the end of the night, the first intimate encounter had left an indelible mark on both participants. According to sources, it was not just a physical experience, but an emotional one, a crossing of a threshold that fundamentally changed the relationship. It was a moment of revelation, connection, and undeniable chemistry, and it set the stage for everything that followed. Yet even in the midst of passion and connection, there was awareness of the consequences. William's mind, trained for decades in discipline and public service, was acutely aware of what this meant. The monarchy, the public perception, and the sanctity of his marriage all hung in the balance. Rose, too, understood the gravity of the situation. Each was caught between desire and responsibility, excitement and guilt, intimacy and secrecy. It is a tension that few can truly understand, and yet it lies at the heart of what makes this story so compelling. After the encounter, the secrecy continued. Messages were carefully phrased, meetings carefully planned, and interactions carefully managed to minimize exposure. The palace, the public, and even Catherine herself remained largely unaware of the emotional and physical intimacy that had begun. And yet, insiders suggest, the emotional intensity could not be contained. The connection had shifted from curiosity to something far deeper, an entanglement that would inevitably create ripples across every aspect of their lives. There is a lesson here that transcends the particulars of royal life. Human desire, when combined with secrecy and risk, creates a force that is both compelling and difficult to resist. The very danger of being caught amplifies emotion, makes every glance and touch more meaningful, and transforms ordinary interactions into moments of profound consequence. For William and Rose, the first intimate encounter was that kind of moment, a turning point that would shape the narrative of betrayal, desire, and secrecy that followed. But what makes this encounter particularly striking is the emotional fallout it generated. William, insiders say, was consumed by a mixture of exhilaration and guilt, torn between the thrill of connection and the moral weight of his actions. Rose experienced the same complex interplay of emotion, excitement tempered by caution, desire mingled with fear, and the knowledge that their bond carried risks far beyond their control. These are human emotions, raw and unfiltered, magnified by the unique circumstances of royalty and secrecy. And yet, despite the intensity, one question remained unresolved. What would happen when Catherine discovered the truth? How would she react? Would the bonds of trust and loyalty survive the revelation of this first intimate encounter? Insiders suggest that the emotional consequences were already beginning to ripple, creating tension and uncertainty that neither William nor Rose could fully anticipate. The first encounter marked a definitive shift. From that night forward, the dynamic between William and Rose was transformed. There was no turning back, no simple return to innocence or detachment. The emotional connection had been established, the tension heightened, and the stakes irrevocably raised. Every subsequent interaction would carry the weight of that night. Every glance would echo with its intensity, and every decision would be influenced by the knowledge of what had already occurred. And as with all secrets, the question lingered: how long could it remain hidden? How long before the emotional and practical consequences began to intrude on the carefully curated world of the palace? Insiders hint at the inevitability of discovery, the fragility of secrecy, and the way even the most carefully guarded moments have a way of surfacing. For William and Rose, the first intimate encounter was not just an event. It was the opening chapter of a story that would test loyalty, trust, and human resilience in ways they could not yet comprehend. But what came next would push boundaries even further, testing the limits of discretion, the strength of marriage, and the consequences of desire in a world where privacy is nearly impossible. And no one, not William, not Rose, not Catherine, could have predicted the dramatic fallout that was about to unfold. It's one thing to read about betrayal in the headlines, but it's another to live it. For Princess Catherine, the truth about William's secret connection with Rose Hanburg was not a rumor. It was a private, searing reality that broke through her world like a storm she never saw coming. The moment she discovered what had been happening behind the carefully polished facade of their marriage, it reportedly left her in tears, alone, and questioning everything she thought she knew about love, trust, and loyalty. Imagine, for a moment, the life she led up to that point. Publicly, Catherine was the epitome of grace and composure. Elegant in her attire, measured in her speech, and unwavering in her commitment to her royal duties. Privately, she was devoted to her husband, invested in the family they were building, and focused on charitable work that mattered deeply to her. There was a rhythm to her life, a sense of balance, a belief that her marriage was strong enough to withstand the pressures of public scrutiny. And then, the illusion shattered. According to insiders, the revelation came in a way that was both subtle and undeniable. Perhaps a message misdirected, a whispered confirmation from a confidant, or a photograph that revealed more than anyone should have seen. Whatever the trigger, it was enough to pierce through weeks of secrecy and leave Catherine confronting a painful truth. The man she trusted implicitly had developed a deeply emotional, potentially intimate connection with another woman. The emotional shock, insiders suggest, was immediate and overwhelming. Tears, according to sources, came first, not in anger, but in heartbreak. The kind of tears that emerge when trust is broken, when reality diverges sharply from expectation, when the foundation of your world begins to crumble. Catherine, it is said, retreated into privacy, seeking solace in spaces where she could grieve without the glare of the public eye. How often do we forget that behind the gilded walls of royalty, human emotion is still raw, still fragile, and still intensely private? What made the situation even more excruciating for Catherine was the nature of William and Rose's connection. This wasn't a fleeting flirtation or a momentary lapse. It was, according to insiders, a series of interactions charged with emotional intensity. Every stolen glance, every private conversation, every intimate encounter added layers to the betrayal. And while William may have struggled with guilt and restraint, Catherine had no control over the emotional impact on her own heart. Psychologically, betrayal of this nature carries profound consequences. Trust, once fractured, is incredibly difficult to repair. For someone in Catherine's position, the stakes were magnified exponentially. She was not only grappling with personal heartbreak, but also the public perception of her marriage, the potential scrutiny of the media, and the implications for the monarchy itself. How do you reconcile private pain with public duty? How do you process betrayal when the world expects you to smile, wave, and appear composed? Insiders report that the immediate aftermath of the revelation involved intense private reflection. Catherine reportedly sought advice from trusted confidants, friends, family, and perhaps palace advisors, trying to navigate the storm of emotion that had overtaken her. The grief, the anger, and the sense of violation all collided in ways that left her vulnerable and questioning. How could the man she loved and trusted step into a secret life that excluded her entirely? How could he place desire above loyalty in a way that risked not only their marriage but the reputation of the family? And yet, there is also a human complexity to this moment. Despite the betrayal, Catherine's reaction was reportedly measured, reflective, and deeply emotional. She did not lash out publicly. She did not seek immediate confrontation. Instead, she absorbed the shock, processed her feelings, and began to consider the broader consequences. It is a testament to her composure, her intelligence, and her understanding of the stakes that she did not act impulsively, even in the face of such personal upheaval. Meanwhile, William was reportedly struggling with his own mix of guilt, desire, and fear. For him, the situation had escalated far beyond the initial tension of attraction. Every choice he made, every moment of secrecy, carried potential consequences that could affect not only his marriage but the broader perception of his character, the stability of the royal family, and the trust of the public. And yet, the very connection that caused the turmoil was also the source of undeniable passion and emotional intensity. How do you reconcile such conflicting forces when both are inextricably tied to your sense of self and desire? The emotional weight of this revelation was compounded by the public scrutiny that inevitably followed. Even before Catherine's private heartbreak was fully processed, rumors had begun to circulate. Insiders suggest that palace aides were aware of subtle shifts in behavior, minor inconsistencies in schedules, and the growing tension between William and Catherine. The media, hungry for stories, sensed the tension before the truth fully emerged. And in that environment, Catherine's tears and emotional turmoil became part of a broader narrative she had no control over. It is also important to consider the relational dynamics at play. Marriages, especially those under extreme public scrutiny, rely on trust as their foundation. Once that trust is compromised, the ripple effects are profound. Catherine, insiders say, found herself navigating an emotional landscape where love, loyalty, and betrayal collided. She had to process the shock, manage the public expectations, and decide how to respond in a way that preserved her dignity while addressing the hurt she felt. It's a level of emotional labor that few can fully comprehend, yet it was her reality. One can imagine the private moments that followed. Solitude, reflection, and a sense of betrayal that lingered like a shadow over her life. Tears, sighs, and the quiet questioning of what her future would look like. Could the marriage survive? Could trust be rebuilt? Or had the very foundation of her life been irreparably altered by the actions of the man she loved? These are questions that insiders suggest Catherine grappled with in the days and weeks following the revelation. And yet, amidst the heartbreak, there is evidence of resilience. Catherine, it seems, was determined not to let the scandal define her, not to let public perception dictate her emotional response. She reportedly began to consider her next steps with careful deliberation: how to protect her emotional well-being, how to maintain the public image of composure, and how to navigate the complexities of a marriage shaken to its core. It is a delicate balance, one that requires strength, wisdom, and the ability to act strategically under pressure. The first tears, however, were unavoidable. They represented the raw, human emotion that no title, no duty, and no public expectation could suppress. They were the acknowledgement of betrayal, the recognition of loss, and the beginning of a process that would test not only her marriage but her own resilience. How does one reconcile grief in a life that demands constant poise? How do you honor your feelings while also considering the broader implications for family, reputation, and duty? Insiders note that these moments of private grief were not solitary in their impact. They set off a chain reaction. Emotional, relational, and eventually public, that would influence decisions, confrontations, and revelations in the weeks and months to come. The first tears were not an end, but the beginning of a journey through pain, reconciliation, and the testing of bonds that many would consider unbreakable. And yet, there was also a question that loomed over everything. How would William respond? Would he acknowledge the pain he had caused? Would he attempt to reconcile, explain, or apologize? Or would secrecy, fear, and self-preservation dominate his actions? Insiders suggest that the coming days would reveal the complexity of his emotions, guilt, desire, fear, and the struggle to navigate consequences that extended far beyond the personal sphere. The intensity of this moment cannot be overstated. Catherine's tears were not just about a single act of betrayal. They were about trust shattered, expectations violated, and the collision of personal and public life in a way that few outside the palace could understand. And while the outside world may never fully grasp the depth of her anguish, insiders insist that the emotional toll was immense, shaping every subsequent interaction and decision. And what happened next would elevate the situation from private heartbreak to a storm with public implications. William's next moves, the decisions he made in response to Catherine's pain, and the ripple effects of that first moment of discovery would set the stage for confrontations, revelations, and emotional crises that no one could have anticipated. But what came next would be even more shocking: a confrontation, a confession, and a series of choices that would leave everyone questioning loyalty, trust, and the very nature of love. The world of royalty is never truly private. Every smile, every handshake, every glance is examined, analyzed, and endlessly speculated upon. And once the whispers begin, they rarely remain contained. For Prince William, what had started as secret encounters with Rose Hanburg was about to collide with the unrelenting gaze of the media, transforming private tension into public scrutiny, and setting the stage for a scandal that insiders say would shake the monarchy to its core. At first, the media murmurs were subtle. A photograph misinterpreted, a fleeting report in a tabloid, a hint dropped in a gossip column. Nothing concrete, nothing provable, but enough to spark curiosity, ignite speculation, and fan the flames of intrigue. Royals are constantly under the microscope, and the smallest anomaly can become fodder for headline writers eager to capture attention. A casual glance between William and Rose, a lingering handshake, a shared laugh. These were suddenly magnified into something far more sensational than reality. How does it feel to live under that kind of scrutiny? To have your every action dissected and your every interaction potentially misrepresented? For William, the stakes were extraordinary. Not only was he navigating a secret and intensely emotional connection with Rose, but he was also acutely aware that the public and media were a constant presence, ready to pounce at the first sign of impropriety. The thrill of secrecy, insiders say, was balanced by the fear of exposure, a tension that added an almost unbearable intensity to every encounter. Meanwhile, Catherine's experience of the media began to shift as well. Even before concrete stories surfaced, insiders suggest that subtle shifts in reporting began to reflect the underlying tension in the royal household. Headlines hinted at strained dynamics, photos were scrutinized for hidden signals, and the public's curiosity grew exponentially. The psychological effect on Catherine, already reeling from the emotional betrayal, was profound. How do you process private heartbreak when it is compounded by a public narrative you cannot control? The media, as always, thrives on drama. For journalists, insiders, and gossip writers, there is an almost irresistible urge to connect the dots, fill in gaps, and present a story that will capture attention. And for someone like William, whose life is already a subject of global fascination, even minor indiscretions, or perceived indiscretions, can escalate into full-blown scandals. Sources close to the palace suggest that the first hints of media attention were carefully monitored by aides, who attempted to manage the narrative before it spun out of control. But controlling public perception is an almost impossible task when desire, secrecy, and emotion collide. It's important to understand the role of perception here. The public rarely knows the full truth, and in the absence of verified information, speculation fills the void. Every rumor, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, can amplify tension, increase pressure on the individuals involved, and create consequences that extend far beyond the original situation. For William and Rose, the whispers were more than just inconvenient. They were a looming threat, a constant reminder that their secret could be exposed at any moment. Insiders suggest that these first media murmurs had a profound effect on William's behavior. Reports indicate heightened anxiety, increased caution, and moments of frustration as he navigated the impossible intersection of private desire and public expectation. He had to maintain appearances for the world while managing the emotional fallout behind closed doors, a duality that added layers of complexity to every decision. The challenge was not just to sustain the secret relationship, but to preserve the image of composure expected of a royal heir. For Catherine, the media's growing attention compounded her pain. Even as she grappled with personal betrayal, the looming public gaze added another dimension to her heartbreak. Headlines speculating about marital strain, carefully edited photographs, and subtle innuendo all created a pressure cooker of emotion. Insiders describe her as moving through this period with a combination of resilience and vulnerability, navigating both private grief and public expectation in ways few could imagine. The psychology of scandal is also critical to understanding this period. When private indiscretions become fodder for public speculation, the emotional stakes escalate dramatically. Secrets no longer remain contained. They ripple outward, affecting relationships, reputation, and perception. Every whispered rumor becomes a threat, every misinterpreted interaction a potential headline, and every glance a subject of debate. For William, The knowledge that the media could expose his private connection at any time added both tension and urgency to his already complicated situation. Meanwhile, Rose was not immune to the media's influence. While she did not live under the same constant scrutiny as William or Catherine, she understood that any exposure could have dramatic consequences. The intensity of the secret relationship was magnified by the possibility of discovery. Not just by the palace or Catherine, but by the relentless press that thrives on scandal. It was a dynamic that created both excitement and fear, making every interaction feel charged with significance. Sources indicate that the palace attempted to manage the emerging narrative with precision. Aides were reportedly briefed, schedules were adjusted, and interactions were carefully choreographed to minimize suspicion. Yet, in a world where even the smallest anomaly can be magnified, control is never absolute. The very structure of secrecy and discretion that William and Rose relied upon was fragile, constantly under threat from prying eyes and speculative minds. And yet, the human element remained powerful. Despite the looming media attention, the emotional pull between William and Rose persisted. Their connection, strengthened by secrecy and intensity, became increasingly difficult to resist. How often does desire, when combined with risk, create a force that defies reason? How often does the danger itself amplify emotion, making every glance, every touch, every conversation feel more potent than it should? For William and Rose, the media's whispers only intensified the stakes, making the hidden moments between them even more electric. Catherine, on the other hand, began to sense that the world outside was watching more closely than ever. Insiders report moments of heightened awareness, subtle monitoring of headlines, and an acute understanding that the private pain she experienced might soon become public knowledge. The anticipation of exposure added layers of stress and uncertainty, creating an emotional environment that was as precarious as it was painful. How does one maintain composure when the world may soon witness the unraveling of what was once private and sacred? The consequences of media scrutiny extend beyond reputation. They shape behavior, influence decision-making, and create pressure that can exacerbate existing tensions. For William, the growing attention likely heightened the sense of urgency and complexity surrounding his relationship with Rose. For Catherine, it compounded grief with anxiety, creating a volatile mixture of emotion that insiders suggest influenced her responses in the weeks and months to follow. And the public? They remained largely unaware of the full story, but their perception, guided by rumors and speculation, was beginning to shift. Headlines hinting at marital tension, public appearances that seemed strained, and photographs that suggested something unspoken created an atmosphere of curiosity, suspicion, and intrigue. The media, in effect, was transforming private tension into a narrative that captivated the imagination of millions, without yet revealing the full truth. It's a remarkable paradox. The more private the secret, the more explosive its eventual revelation. And in the case of William, Rose, and Catherine, the media's early whispers were only the beginning. The tension between secrecy and exposure, desire and duty, intimacy and scrutiny, created a perfect storm that insiders describe as both exhilarating and terrifying. As the whispers grew louder, the stakes became impossible to ignore. William's private indulgences, his emotional entanglement with Rose, and Catherine's heartbreak were no longer confined to the walls of the palace. They were now dancing on the edges of public consciousness. And once the media fully turned its attention, the consequences, insiders warn, would be unavoidable, irreversible, and potentially catastrophic. But what happened next would push the story beyond whispers into the realm of undeniable scandal. Private encounters, hidden desires, and emotional betrayals were about to collide with public exposure in a way that no one, William, Rose, or Catherine, could fully anticipate. And what came next would change everything. The secret was about to erupt into a storm that would shake the royal household, test loyalties, and redefine the lives of everyone involved. The tension had been building for weeks, simmering beneath the polished surface of royal life, until it became impossible to ignore. Prince William's secret connection with Rose Hanburg was no longer just a private concern. It had begun to cast shadows over his marriage, his conscience, and his very sense of identity. And for Princess Catherine, the truth was no longer a distant whisper or a subtle suspicion. It had arrived, demanding acknowledgement, demanding confrontation, and demanding answers that neither of them were fully prepared to give. The confrontation, insiders report, did not occur in public or with cameras rolling. It happened behind closed doors, in the quiet, solemn spaces where the weight of truth can be felt most profoundly. Imagine the scene: a stately room, perhaps a sitting room in the palace, its elegance a stark contrast to the storm of emotion about to unfold. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across the floor. The air was thick with anticipation, with unspoken words, with the gravity of what was about to happen. Catherine, sources say, entered the room with a mixture of resolve and trepidation. She had spent days, maybe weeks, processing her feelings, grief, betrayal, confusion, and even anger. But now the moment had come to confront the man she trusted, the man she had shared her life with, the man who had allowed secrecy to erode the foundation of their marriage. The emotional weight of such a confrontation is almost unimaginable. How do you begin a conversation about betrayal with someone you still love? How do you articulate the depth of hurt without losing composure? William, meanwhile, was acutely aware of what was coming. Insiders describe him as tense, conflicted, and deeply anxious. The private indulgence he had pursued with Rose now faced the scrutiny of the person whose trust was paramount. The emotional stakes could not have been higher. This was not a casual discussion, not a fleeting argument, but a reckoning with the consequences of desire, secrecy, and human error. How do you defend actions that you know were both exhilarating and morally complicated? How do you explain a connection that you cannot deny, yet cannot fully justify? The initial moments of the confrontation, according to sources, were charged with silence. Words were measured, glances held, and both parties were acutely aware of the gravity of the discussion. Insiders suggest that Catherine began by articulating her feelings of hurt and betrayal, not in a frenzy of anger, but with precise, cutting clarity. The room, elegant and serene as it may have appeared to an outsider, became a crucible where truth, emotion, and confrontation collided.